I'm very pleased with an excellent panel. Maybe to introduce them quickly, going over there, that's Jörg Andreas Krüger. We're very pleased to have you here. You're the elected president in 2019 of NABU. NABU is the German nature management organization. I think it's one of the largest nature management organizations even in Europe. And you have, I think, 940,000 members at the moment, which is incredible. Yeah, so thank you for being here. Okay. Then we have Angelo Salsi, and Angelo Salsi he's the man who knows everything. He has the history also of conservation management in Europe. He worked for the European Commission and European institutions for more than 29 years, I think. And so we're looking forward to hear your stories and your advice. And we have Amy Johnson, thank you, all the way from the US. So very nice to have you here. Yeah, Amy is conservation biologist and program director at the Smithsonian Institute in the USA. And maybe you can say a bit more about your work later. Yeah. And we all heard Charlie Burrell with a very inspiring speech. So thank you, Charlie. Yeah. Okay. So we have 3 topics we will pass during this hour. And the first one is on the financial mechanisms and tools that are available for supporting private land conservation. It's a bit a technical part. The second part is about how the need for bringing private landowners, farmers and conservationists together, and the need for more cooperation. And the third part is the way forward. So we have an excellent project here, a live EMPLC project which builds trust and community. And how do we move from that? And there is time for a bit of interaction. So I have a few statements also for the audience. So I need you to help me. And I'll do a practice first. So if you are a pro of this statement, you raise your hand. If you're against it, you leave it down. Yeah. So the first statement could be: ownership of private land in these times is rather a burden than a benefit. Sorry. So ownership of private land is more a burden than a benefit in these times. Who's pro? Okay. That's brave. That's dare. Very good. I'm curious to hear. Why do you think it's a burden?
It's an opinion of many landowners in Estonia, but to understand it, one has to understand the Estonian nature conservation system, which is obligatory, taking the land from landowners, basically their rights away when the species is found.
Okay. So you feel nature as a threat in that sense as well?
Not nature.
Oh, the regulations around it. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So it's interesting that despite having private land, which also brings a lot of duties, most people see it as a benefit. And I was curious, Charlie, because you own an estate for such a long period already, how would you perceive such a situation?
There's a spectrum, isn't there? Mm-hmm. I'll just tell you a little very short story. One of my neighbours has a tenant farmer, and the tenant farmer takes around young farmers every year to look at nature on his property. In the last 15 years, most of the young farmers that he takes around can't tell him the names of the trees in the landscape. And England has only got 32 woody shrubby plants that made it across the channel before it was isolated from mainland Europe. So if we can't even tell the trees, the names of the trees, what are we actually saying there? What's happened to the education of the next generation that we are going to entrust with the management of nature? I don't know. So I think we're talking about a spectrum. So some landowners are incredibly good when you're looking through that lens, and some are very bad. And I think that's the difficulty, isn't it? Yeah. It's how do you take people on journeys through what we need to do collectively to make a difference.
Okay, thank you. If I may continue on that path, but my question was also related to being a landowner for such a long period, and you said it's very important to have joy in this work, but still it comes also with a lot of difficult issues. You want to preserve, you want to keep it for a long period in your family, and you want to serve society with what you do. Is it sometimes giving you gray hair? Not yet, I see. So.
Yes, but I guess you're born into an incredibly privileged position anyway, so that just is part of the package. And I think that certainly the education for the larger landowners in Britain is that comes with a cost, and the cost is responsibility, stewardship, all the things that we are taught from birth. So I think that you just got to take that as part of what one has to do and try and, you are taking on these quite complex, difficult in terms of tax, difficult in terms of social, difficult in terms of nature. Everything is quite complex for a landowner. And you have a stewardship responsibility, you have a responsibility to your local communities. You are the local community. You're providing all the housing. You're providing the village. Perhaps you're in your control in England, in particular. You are the community. So that's a big responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I have another statement. I'm going to a different topic now. Make a jump a bit. I have another statement for you. And because one of the main objectives of the LIFE-EM PLC project was to look at different financing mechanisms and tools that are available in Europe. And this morning we saw a kind of tour de Europe of different options. So I was curious, when you look at your own country, are you aware in your own country of a tax system that is in favor of private land conservation, that supports private land conservation? Who is aware of his own country, the tax system that's available for private land conservation? Anyone? Yeah? So I see Belgium, I see the Netherlands, I see the US, the UK. Yeah? Yeah, okay, thank you. And if I go a step further, and if I ask, so the current tax system in your country, does it work in the current, sorry, I have to rephrase. Can the current tax system in your country be improved to support private land conservation? If you're in pro, please raise your hand. So then it's almost the whole of Europe. Okay, that's a challenge. Okay. Amy, then I'm going to you. Yeah. So, well, you come all the way from the US, and you look around here, and I heard you love the city, so that's very nice. This morning you saw this tour d'Europe of all these different regulations in different countries, etc. I was curious because the US is one country to me. I know 50 states, but it's one country. Is it more a unity in the US, or is there also a very large diversity in every state?
Sure, that's a good question.
Okay.
I'm Canadian, so I don't know a lot about the US. But I will discuss what I know. I've lived there since 2007, and I'm still learning. But yes, there are regulations that are nationwide, but it's also very much state specific, and even down to the county in which you live as to what financial incentives or support or tax incentives that there may be. So for example, we talked a lot about conservation easements this morning. That is a really big topic in the area where I live. I live in one of the highest densities of conservation easements, which is wonderful. In our area, a conservation easement is protection of that land indefinitely. So as a landowner, you're basically donating that land to an easement holder. So there's many NGOs that hold these easements. And so even if you sell your land, it can never be developed. So there's a lot of people who are very concerned about their land being developed. They've grown up there, they've raised their families there, and development is a huge issue in the US, especially for us. We're about an hour and a half outside of Washington, DC. So there is a big risk of development, and it's just a constant concern for landowners. But I think the difference with our easements too is there's a lot more flexibility in the management. So you put your land under easement, but you aren't really limited to how you manage that land. Really, the only thing you're limited in doing is building additional housing, barns. Though you're very limited in development on your own land, but you can still farm it, you can still timber it. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And you also get a really large tax incentive for doing so. You also get a tax incentive, though, for putting it under agriculture. So you could either, have it as a farm or an easement, but you could do both, and you get tax incentives for both. Okay. There's a lot of funding opportunities for landowners in the U.S. that come from nonprofits, state and federal funding. But I could talk about that for an hour, so I can let you focus the conversation.
Would be interesting, maybe, but maybe another question for you before we move on is that because now you've seen a bit of the situation in Europe compared to the US. What are you jealous about when you're here in Europe and thinking about nature conservation in Europe? Is there something that you could learn from what we do?
Absolutely. I loved hearing about the different conservation in all of the different countries. So I really appreciated the tiered conservation strategy. I think that was in Belgium that was talked about because I just submitted a publication. We just did a study of biodiversity on private lands that are under conservation easements and private lands that aren't. And in our preliminary analysis, we are not really seeing a difference. And so are these easements optimizing habitat for biodiversity? Not necessarily. They are protecting that land indefinitely from being developed, which is a very important thing for these species. But we're not necessarily optimizing habitat opportunities for those species. So I think I'd like to see more of a tiered system where landowners would get larger tax incentives or even payments, as you were talking about, to help preserve biodiversity on these lands while also protecting the land from development. It's a great idea.
Yeah. Thank you. So still some work to do in the US. That's good to hear. Otherwise, we would be jealous. Thank you very much, Amy. Yeah. Angelo, if I may go to you. And yeah, there's also another microphone. So maybe we keep this one here and the other one. Yes, that's good. Well, this is my chance to ask you a bit about questions because I'm quite new in this field in Europe, and I was really interested in when I entered also with Eurocide and discovered about the differences between privately owned land and land owned by nature management bodies or government bodies. Is that what I heard, and that's also it's only a rumor, is that 60% on average of protected areas in Europe are owned by private land organizations or private land individuals. And that number, I could never found any reference to that, but it's a story that you hear all the time. Have you heard it? Is it something completely new to you? But we know from Spain, like Matthias, that it's a number that is quite regular. But
No, I heard it also, and I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, that there is any statistic or official data that indicates that this is the truth or not. We go around, and I did it for years, stating that more or less at least 50% of that land is in the hands of private owners. Whether this is right or wrong would require such a long study that probably we're right.
Okay, and then also the question would be: does it make sense to have more insight in this? But still, another rumor that's going around is that because you were involved in a lot of EU funding schemes supporting nature conservation everywhere in Europe. Right? You can tell very nice stories about that. Often you also hear that for smaller or even bigger but more individual private landowners, it's more difficult to get access to this European money, helping in supporting them to improve biodiversity conservation on their land. Do you think that's true? And
I suspect that it is unfortunately true, like she was stating before. I mean, there is this professor from the University of Bologna the other day who stated that USA innovates, China replicates, Europe regulates. And I think that this is, maybe it's a simplification or an oversimplification, but it does depict decently well the state of the context. My problem is that now that I became very recently, not like lucky Charlie from Generation, a farmer, I bought myself a piece of land, I started understanding why my colleagues in Digi Environment were saying that the farmers, they hardly have a real access to the measures that are financed by the Common Agricultural Policy, which is the one that really pays the individuals, if you want, to make good in environmental terms. And it has hardly anything to do in reality with the design that is done in Brussels. Most of the problem of the drama is down to the level of the implementation at regional level. So they are complex by design, and the complexity is the mechanics. So to give you an example, I bought a piece of land which is biologically managed. You have the right to get a certain premium per hectare for that. But because I bought it 15 days before the list of recipients of that premium was published, I don't have the right. So I have to wait for the next call that will be published by the regional government to apply for it. I will get into a transition scheme for 3 years, and it has been managed biologically for generations, that piece of land. So, and then they go and they ask the legals. And the legals, what do they tell them? They tell them that since it was written like that, the call, you have to do it like that. So I think that the complexity of this is killing the part of the animal, and that's where the bigger problem starts for the individual. The individuals, obviously, they can participate as in an associated form to bigger projects, but for them, getting access to grants, schemes like LIFE or things like that, it's almost impossible. So that's...
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll come to the question how to improve that situation, but thank you. I think you just showed a lot of, I think the audience has the same experience as you said, regarding the complexity of regulations and systems on the implementation side. Yeah. Well, and then last one, Jörg Andreas. I was curious, maybe a bit about the same question I asked Charlie about having, because NABU has ownership over quite some land in NABU and the responsibilities there. How do you cope with that in day-to-day life? Because you're also not grey, so...
Yes, I mean, I always say if you want to be a land manager or landowner, you have to be the type for it. I mean, you can get crazy and become crazy about all the challenges and all the regulations, and yeah, that is one side of the medal. But on the other side, you have all the pleasure of managing, of designing, of making decisions on your own. And so that's why we decided to have all of our land in a foundation, in the NABU Foundation for Natural Heritage. And that is something where we can bring together all the expertise, and on the other hand, to do the risk management. The reason 25 years ago for the foundation of the new organizational model was that we had one area of land which was owned by a local group in the 30s or 40s. We are an old organization. And then somebody had an accident there. And so we never know that this area is still owned by us. And so, but we had to pay. And so that was the reason to say we have to be professional. And that is maybe the most important thing. Land management and being a landowner means you have to be a professional landowner. Otherwise, you will become trouble someday.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, I will also like to open the floor for the audience. I think there are 2 microphones in the room. So if you have questions regarding this aspect of financing mechanisms and tools in your country regarding conservation, then it's now the chance to ask. And I see 2, maybe from Finland first.
Yeah, thank you. In my intervention, I briefly mentioned ecological compensation. What is your take on that?
Ecological compensation. And do we have someone specific in mind, this question?
No, just in general, when you have, for example, green energy investments that need land,
yeah.
So it would make sense to compensate that by having conservation areas X times the land you are using.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the habitat banking approach. So I see you not with some.
No, I think we have to look on different stories. I mean, one is the compensation under the current nature conservation law in Germany, for example. That's how you described it. If you build up a wind farm or you build up a street and you go in a grassland or into a forest, then you have to compensate the nature. And what we are asking for the government is that we put all the measurements for the compensation together in the model of a green infrastructure. At the moment, we have some regulations still in place where you say, oh, it has to be close to the place where the wind farm of the streets has to be built. It has to be close to the type of habitat which has to be destroyed or affected. And we say, yes, that is a good rule in principle. But we see that we run out of time and out of space in Germany a little bit. And so we want to have these green infrastructure, a kind of system, a model like in the landscape, which we have seen in your slide, where you have the protected area as some cornerstones, and then you have connection pathways. Robuste Biotopverbindungen was that in the Netherlands for a while as a concept. And that's the law thing. What we see now is that under the CSRD and in the rumors and the excitement which is now in the business sector and in the financial sector, that they are starting to think about what can we do along our supply chains? What do we have to do? Now the first companies are learning that they have a biodiversity footprint, and they ask us, biodiversity, what do I have to do with that? And then we explain. And the question will be, what can you do to reduce the footprint? And so do it more efficient and blah, blah, blah. But at the end, you will always have a footprint if you import pineapples or bananas from Latin America, or if you have dairy farms and so on. Mm-hmm. And what is the compensation mechanism for that? And I think we are on the edge of a change in the change of the system. We are used to have only public money, or more or less only public money, for building up green infrastructure and systems. But I expect that we will see some comparable, like the climate discussion 10 years ago. First, scientists came up with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Then first asset owner, so the large insurances came up and said, okay, we will only finance projects if you as a company can prove that you are on a 1.5 degree pathway. Mm-hmm. Under the Paris Agreement. And for that, you have to change all your business model and you have to do compensation. And that pushed an enormous amount of money into the system. And we have all heard about the more or less well-organized projects of climate compensation around the globe. I expect that will come for the biodiversity aspect as well. You see first part of that with regard to water in the landscape. Mm-hmm. The most complex will be the question of lapwing skylarks and species and habitats, but we will come to that. And we have to be prepared for it. And for that, I mean, I just had discussions about that with some large German industries. They said, okay, what can we do to how can we build up an institution where we can give all the money and this institution is then financing the transition of agriculture, for example, or is financing the green infrastructure forever then, and not only for 10 or 4 years. That is something where we all together have to work on.
Thank you very much. I think you already jumped to part 3 of this discussion, but that's good. And Charlie, I see you want to respond.
I guess that what will be of interest in this room is the BNG, the biodiversity net gain that's now become mandatory. It's based on, you have to do an assessment of the land that you're about to develop, whatever scale. Your assessment is based on, it's called the DEFRA metric, 4.1 or wherever it's got to, has been through a whole load of iterations. So you make an assessment of your land, you then assess how many units of biodiversity are going to be affected by your development. You then, as a developer, then have to replace those plus a minimum of 10%. The slight thing that came in right at the end of the whole process of setting this up was you were also allowed to account for some of your units on site. So your development site could account for, if you put in bat boxes and green space and so on, they account for some of the units that you're destroying. So that meant that there's less units available for the marketplace. Now, as a supplier of solutions for the developer, the marketplace is settling down at about 21,000 to 31,000 pounds a unit. A typical project from a landowner's point of view, supplying these units, you could get 3 or 4 units per hectare. So suddenly you're seeing the figures become incredibly interesting, and you're only signing up to 30 years for this model. So 30 years, and you maybe have 2 or 3 times the value of your land as an upfront payment from a developer to then supply the change on the land for only 30 years. So that's that model.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting topic, and I would propose to come back to that later in the discussion, because there was another question.
We have a question here.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello, my name is Geoffroy de Cagnière. I'm active in forest management in the various countries in Europe. And I have a question in link with what you just said, Charlie, is that when we speak about land conservation, we are speaking about a very long term and a very long-term commitment for the landowner. And then when we speak about subvention or way to finance it, it's depending on shorter agenda. As politics, we see that frameworks can change at the European level, national level, and so forth. How do you cope with the risk that you invest in a project, a lot of resource, you commit in contracts and things that you could have changed in the way it's financed, or even in the value you put on the action you do in certain structure? I'm very happy to have your point of view and maybe a point of view more from the institution as well, and the reaction of the panelists about that. Thank you.
I think I'm not the expert to have this question fired at me. What I'm seeing, though, is in this voluntary sector, the carbon and biodiversity credits that are being created and touted, there is always this problem about time. And I guess the 30 years, which everyone is still settling on, is a period of time which is a human's lifetime in work. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of not tying the next generation to things. I'm guessing that's where it's come from. I mean, why 30 years? Why not 100 years? Why not 20 years? I mean, I saw figures on the board here which were 24 years. And I was thinking, or 25 years. I couldn't quite work out that, but that's a different thing. So I can't answer that question. I mean, obviously, establishing woodland, all the costs are up front. You know, the first 30 years, you've got your thinnings, your first thinnings, perhaps your second thinning, depending on where you are in the world. So a lot of the costs are up front. The actual carbon is an even more complex picture, isn't it? When does it actually start to capture carbon? When does it stabilize? When does it stop capturing carbon and starts to emitting nitrous oxides and methane, and that takes out, you know, so all of that complexity is still being worked on now, isn't it? Someone more expert than me.
Maybe I would propose to go to another question, because there will be time to discuss more later on.
Okay, thank you, Harm. I am Dieter Kuipers. I am from the Mosaic project, where we work together with ILO and Eurosite on these issues. And I'm very curious, you asked Ms. Johnson whether she was jealous of our situation in Europe. Actually, I was jealous when she reacted, when she said, we don't make this divide in between conservation and agriculture. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious whether the panel, or maybe Mr. Burrell, who is a farmer and as well a conservationist, to speak to this issue. I see in Europe a lot of people, grassroots organizations as well, coming up with food forests, which is forest and food, agriculture, conservation. Okay, some forests, of course, we need for logging as well. But of course, we have this huge divide, and I think it's a huge problem. But I'm curious to know what the panel thinks about this.
Thank you for the question. Maybe you also want to respond? Yeah.
I would like to respond to that too. While there isn't necessarily a divide in the tax benefits, there is a range in which agriculture can contribute to conservation and also reverse conservation. And I think the issue with these easements is it doesn't necessarily limit to what extent the agriculture is happening or the intensity of the agriculture. As a scientist, I do see a lot of value in agriculture and actually helping conservation and preserving species and habitat in many, many ways. And so I would like to see more of that being integrated into the limits that come along with conservation easements. And we're not there yet. I think we need to do a lot more research, but I think there is a lot of potential there.
Can I ask you another question, because you're having the mic right now? No, it's because yesterday you showed, and for some of us that were there, you showed a very inspiring example of your work in the US with farmers together, improving, and also with science together, improving land conservation for meadowlark birds and all different kind of birds and soil health, etc. In what sense did these kind of financial mechanisms and tools from the government, etc., help farmers to make a transition of what was the reason that they want to make a change on their land? Huh?
There's so many reasons, and it's very specific to each landowner. Sometimes it's societal pressure. Mm-hmm. Other times it's incentives. Other times it's an actual need to improve productivity. And they know that they need to look to the soil to do that. As far as in incentives that are available to assist farmers, we do have the Farm Bill, which is, coming out with an incredible amount of funding for agriculture, but also has a really strong focus on soil health, which aligns really well with a lot of conservation practices. And so we're seeing a lot of alignment with agriculture and conservation. And in addition, you may have seen yesterday the Secretary of Agriculture mentioning these climate smart commodity grants. And these are, I can't remember how many billions of dollars are being handed out, but one of our partners at American Farmland Trust was just awarded these. And I think what's excellent about this specifically is the way they're directing their funding is they're taking farmers that are already practicing regenerative agriculture and or conservation in their agricultural practices. And they're actually paying them to become mentors to help sort of other more traditional farmers through that transition so that they can have the confidence to transition their farm to a more sort of conservation-friendly landscape. And I think, that's just starting now, and I think we're about to see a lot more movement there because I just see a lot more movement when it's coming farmer to farmer, right? When it's being influenced through neighbors and farmers versus the government or scientists, telling farmers what to do. It just doesn't work as well.
Thank you very much. It's like a mix of motivations to change the system. Thank you. You want to? No?
In your hand.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, I would like to continue to the second part. And so I have another statement for you. So in the European Networks for Private Land Conservation project, and also with the successor, the ELCN project, we saw an increased cooperation between nature management organizations and private landowners on European level, but also on different regional levels. You saw the examples from this morning. So I was curious, because we also know that there are also these continuous tensions between the different sectors. So I was curious, in the last 5 years, the gap between individual landowners, farmers and site managers has decreased. So if you're pro, in the last 5 years, the gap between individual landowners, farmers and site managers has decreased. What do you think? Sorry? Already they're asking, what gap? So that's good. Maybe I have to explain a bit. For example, in the Netherlands, where I come from, we had in the past this situation that we had a different opinion between sometimes the larger management organizations, the government, and the private landowner organizations, or the individual private landowners. So there's a kind of tension sometimes between these sectors. And the same goes for farmers. With Eurocide and ELO, we work with a lot of farmers together, and we have a good cooperation. But there are also tensions between the farming sector and the conservation sector. So I was curious, when you look at these times, and we all know about the protests on the street, also in Belgium yesterday. I was curious, when you look at this gap, if you think it exists, do you think it has decreased? Was the cooperation increased? Did the gap decrease or not? Is my statement too complex? Yes? Then Angelo, please just respond.
I have to explain your complex statement.
Please do. Sorry, I was not clear.
So the way I see it, and why I put up my hand, agreeing that it has decreased, indeed, is the stories
Good.
like this project. Yesterday there was a very symbolic image, Jörg Andreas sitting beside Thierry Escaille, and this would have not happened 5 years ago. It's symbolic, okay, but it's a sign of a change which has happened also on the ground in many situations, like in Italy, thanks to the WWF, or in other places like that. The problem is that if you look at the protests by the farmers, it's the interpretation of those protests that we get in the media or by the politicians, some politicians, not all of them. I have the feeling that the farmers are complaining about something which had little to do with the environmental aspects coming from the Green Deal, the farm to fork and things like that. So, for example, in Italy, I've never heard a single farmer saying, take away cross-compliance from Pillar 1 of the Common Agricultural Policy. They are complaining, and yesterday they were complaining again, because they are not paid a good money for what they produce. They want to stay in business, and to stay in business, you have to invent something if the prices go down or competition is too harsh. So that's what they are asking for. So I think that what were once enemies are now probably lesser enemies, even though the formal or the normal interpretation that we get from the media seems to show almost the opposite. I don't think this is the case, at least in my rural area where I have now started my new, let's say, adventure. It's one of the largest biologically managed consortia in the whole of Italy. It's thousands and thousands of hectares of continuous biologically managed land, and it's a beautiful landscape, so full of biodiversity. These are farmers, real farmers.
Thank you, Angelo, also for explaining. And I see a lot of reactions, but maybe Jörg Andreas first, and then you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can only underline and agree to that. I mean, we see a much better and much deeper cooperation at all levels, local level, regional level, and the federal level in Germany, for example. What we have is that we have louder voices of protest on both sides. And these louder voices have more public attention at the moment. And we have these complex situation with all the additional crises. I mean, it's not only the ecological crisis, it's the wars, the markets, the global economy, and so on. And that's these loudness brings other actors on the field at the moment. So in Germany, we have the situation, we have protests of the farmers. And especially in January, it was organized by the Farmers Association. That went well, it was okay. Now we have some more or less independent groups organizing their protests in more radical ways, sometimes in more dangerous ways. And that makes this image that now everything of cooperation is the story of the past. I don't have the feeling, and we in Germany, we have still a good contact to the Farmers Association at the federal level, and we are in very close discussions, and with the landowners organization as well. We have a stable connection, and we sometimes agree to disagree to some political questions, but that's not a danger for the cooperation itself.
Thank you, Jörg Andreas. Maybe the lady.
I think.
Can you tell you who you are?
Oh yes, I will. I'm Amber Mourgeois. I'm working for the Dutch organization for the private landowners. I'm a colleague of René de Bond, and what we see in Holland, and especially in the south of Holland, that we start working together to tackle all the problems that we have, also on reserving the nature, but also all the water problems that we have in Holland. And because we sit on the table with each other, with all the parties which are involved, so also the farmers, but also the municipalities and the water management organizations, the nature organizations, we sit together on the table and are identifying where the problems are and trying to solve them together. And I think that's the only way we can do this. And yeah, if you want to talk more about, because I have good examples now in Holland, and we try also with the private landowners to find projects to do them, to put them together and to show them how important private land ownership is still important in the countryside. And that's why we also want to work together with the farmers, because they are also the landowners and important. And the pressure on the land is so big with all the problems that we have. So I think it's a big opportunity for all of us to stand together. And that's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear statement and good to hear. There is some room for some questions regarding this aspect. Maybe.
Yes, good morning. I'm Joseph van der Stegen. I work for the CINEA, which is the Commission Agency for Life. And in terms of support, I would like to say, and gap, I would like to say that indeed, I think with this LIFE project, the gap between NGOs and landowners is reducing, and it's a huge progress. And I would insist on the fact that it's the third project that the Commission is funding on private land conservation. So there is interest on that from the Commission. Now, a lot will depend on what happened at member state level, because the situation are very different from one region, from one country to the other. So a lot needs to be done at member state level. We see that there are very good or promising examples in some member states, but in others there is almost maybe nothing. And I think if you want to see land conservation progressing, there should be joint initiatives by NGOs and landowners that are less conservative than the others, more open-minded. And this is often, I think, a minority of the landowners, a minority of the people among the NGOs, a minority of the people among the farmers or the foresters. And they should work together to promote it to the authorities. And I think this is important, and I know that there are ongoing initiatives, and I hope that these LIFE projects can help that at member state level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, despite my... Of course, yeah.
I think that's an excellent comment. And I just wanted to add to that, because I think it's also important to think about diversity of funding, right? So we have diversity of groups coming together and sharing ideas, but as far as available funding, if there's only state funding available, sometimes that can really be limiting to certain types of producers or landowners. And so ensuring that you have funding sources from family foundations and government funding, as well as NGO funding, I think it's really important to be opening up that funding pool to make sure that there's opportunities for everybody to be able to engage in these practices.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, despite my unclear statement, I'm going to do one last attempt for such a statement. And if it doesn't work, then we'll see. But it's about the last part of this discussion. It's about the way forward. One of the big issues we're thinking about is about funding. Different funding mechanisms, and I hear all the discussions this morning is maybe not even looking at the government, but maybe only as a facilitator, to create systems that are creating opportunities for other types of money coming in to support private landowners, farmers, to change situations on their land. So the statement is, I believe in a biodiversity credit system. Who is pro? Okay. Well, interesting. It's like 50-50, something like that. And I'm very curious because we had in the corridors we had quite some discussions regarding this concept. Maybe Charlie, I would be very interested to hear your vision on that going forward.
So in the UK, we've been thinking about this, as everyone has, I guess. And what we were seeing in the voluntary credit markets was this money pouring into plantation models, planting eucalypts, planting Sitka spruce, planting the wrong thing in the wrong places. And then we had the kickback, and we had all the damage that did to the voluntary carbon market. So the money then stopped. What we were then thinking, well, we need to come up with a scientifically based, verifiable biodiversity credit. And all of you who are ecologists know that that's impossible. But let's give it a go. Let's see if we can come up with a model. So a group of us, through the Wallacea Trust, spent 2 years beating around the idea. And we came up with a model which was based on a price indices. So if you look at an inflation rate around the world, different countries put in a basket of goods, they then monitor the basket of goods, that throws out a percentage, that gives you your inflation rate. So the same idea, you put into your basket a set of metrics, at least 5 metrics, maybe more, and those metrics, as they move up and down, this is butterflies, birds, arthropods, or whatever you're trying to see what's going to happen through change. You put those into a basket and then you measure that. You also apply a whole lot of other things. So because you're wanting to look at biomass, you're wanting to look at rarity, frequency. So it's not just about biodiversity. You need to have it slightly skewed towards several things. So that then gives you an idea of, and that will work in all 1,500 ecoregions around the planet, and that will give you a surety and a verifiable surety that actually what you're doing isn't just good carbon. And I guess the worry is, because we know what we're all like out there, you produce good carbon, and that may be good from one person delivering on that, but it might not be so good from another person delivering on that.
Angelo?
Take your own.
Yep.
No, there is one thing I would like to share with you. I've been 29 years managing in one way or another, dealing with the LIFE program, and I was raised like, you know, these big balls that pull a chariot. I only saw in front of me, so I thought that life was everything. That for nature conservation, biodiversity, if there is no life, actually everything simply sinks down. In reality, moving out, because I retired and having the opportunity also to join Charlie in RePlanet and in other adventures, I realized quite rapidly that the amount of potential money out there, private money, is 10-folds, 20-folds what the public could ever put, and certainly what life can do. Still, life is a magic instrument. The problem is that we are leaving the rest either partially untapped or fully uncoordinated. So the famous public-private partnership, it's a very nice statement, but it's hardly ever practiced in And because of our daily routine, I mean, you don't have time to think about it or to look at it with curious eyes. You don't want to mix up the cards. Why should I get into business with a philanthropic fund? I am a public body or anything like that. But the reality on the ground is that luckily our beneficiaries, they mix up the cards. So they go shopping around trying to find the money. And one of those resources could be indeed biodiversity credits. It's coming up. I am partially hoping and partially fearing what the regulator might do the time they start looking at it seriously. Because, you know, so my hope is that entities like Replanet and others will shape biodiversity credits to a status that it will be a sort of a given. And in that moment, if the regulator steps in, they simply take what's already there and say, this is the rule, which would, it's like being IKEA in the furnitures, if you want. And then the things will work out, and we will tap, and you cannot imagine the amount of resources which are available out there. If you only account for the CO2 credits and how much money has gone into that, I mean, it's, if we have half of it for biodiversity, I mean, it's life, it becomes a thing like this in Europe.
Yep.
So
I think you have high hopes, Angelo. Thank you. And maybe Jörg.
I wonder, and it would be interesting for me to hear a little bit. We have seen many people don't believe in biodiversity credits. So, are there some reasons for that, or what are the concerns?
Who thinks it's bollocks?
Yeah, maybe to answer your question, my perspective, and again, I'm active in forest management business for private landowners, so we are looking at all the systems, and also active in a foundation trying to fight against the erosion of the biodiversity, so we are also looking on that angle about that. I think that the first thing in both of the activity that we stated is that we need a metric to put value on something, and that value can go to the landowner. So the landowner can actually have the resources to make his role of very good citizens and conservation, because all landowners have that citizenship role of conservation. The metric regarding carbon is very easy. Carbon is like, you can measure that. There are formulas, of course. When I say easy, you need to know what you do, but it's doable. At the end of the day, carbon in the soil and outside the soil, you know what you do. With biodiversity, the matrix is very hard to set up because we are speaking about diversity, and that diversity is evolving. When you speak about an ecosystem as well, an ecosystem can change and be another ecosystem. An ecosystem is adapting, so it's something living and really hard to measure. What I think in that kind of way to put value on those things, that is very important to have a metric, because you need to have a metric to put money on that. Maybe you can put constraints on that metric. The first thing I'm thinking is how to be sure that when you put value on a metric, you're not destroying something else. And I see that biodiversity and all the other ecosystemic services should be safety net, or like a way to structure the activity, but the carbon could be a way to measure it. We don't need to put a measure on everything that we do. We just need to have a way to have the incentive, and that's the goal. And I think it's very good to take a bit of heights here and go on that. Sorry, subject is interesting.
No, thank you very much. Very interesting remarks. Thank you. You want to respond?
Yeah, I agree. It is much more complex than measuring CO2 to do that for biodiversity. And we have to learn a lot, and I guess we will see some mistakes. But I mean, we make already some progress. I mean, you have maybe heard about the German top-up payments for some kind of sustainability top-up for forest owners whenever they say the composition of the forest, the structure of the forest. So some elements more than just how much CO2 is in the forest are now taking into account, and then you can apply for the top-up of 120 euros or 150 euros per hectare and year. So that can be a start to a really good payment for ecosystem services. And we have only to organize that it's not only funded by public money anymore, since public money will run short. We have to open the doors for the private money.
Yeah. Okay.
But I agree, it's
Thank
much
you.
more complex than planned.
Thank you. You want to respond to this or not? It's okay. Yeah. I'm going to my final questions because we have to come to an end. Already, sorry, but yeah, we're almost talking more than an hour. So maybe Amy, my question for you is: I'm really curious because yesterday you showed this excellent example from the US where you were working, and what will be your next steps? Are you? Maybe I can explain. Are you also intending of scaling up or going to? Yeah?
Scaling up. I get asked all the time, when are you going to expand? And
Yeah.
that's a difficult question because I feel
Your aim is 1 million acres.
well, I feel.
doubling in the next 5 years, your goal.
But I don't have to do that. You know, I think my way of scaling up is partnering with other organizations that can double up our work, right? So we're putting a lot of effort into sharing knowledge with groups in other states because they're interested in how do we build similar networks. Now, every region is different. Land management is different. Land management goals are different. The landowners are different. The rules are different. Funding is different. But I think the foundation is the same. It's just identifying the partners that can make it happen. I think that's really important. So scaling up through partnerships and sharing knowledge, to me, is really important. This biodiversity credit thing, I think, is really fascinating. I agree it's very complex, but someone needs to make the first move. You know, we could spend our whole lives trying to develop models that are the perfect biodiversity credit, but in the meantime, we're going to lose all of our biodiversity. So I feel like we need to find organizations that can take that risk, try the first model it out in a specific region where we can see what works, what doesn't, change it, keep going until it's in a place where you can expand it to other regions. And so what we're doing in the US through my program right now is we're kind of just starting that modeling effort within our small network. We're developing metrics where we can work with landowners to create basically a conservation scorecard. And we're developing those metrics off of 13 years of biodiversity data we've been collecting across the region. And so this is cattle farms, hay farms, farms that are completely rewilded. So we have a whole spectrum. But my hope is that through this, we'll get feedback. We'll get negative feedback. We'll get positive feedback. But we can take that into account to build something that works and is scalable throughout the US and hopefully globally eventually. So there's my big
Thank you very
plan.
much. Yeah, very good. Yeah, because of time, we have to come to an end. But my final question would be for you, Angelo, if I may. It's because now we come at the end of the Live EMPLC project. There will be some new events coming up, like the event in France in a few weeks from now. And we have a conservation finance bootcamp in Romania in May. So please check the websites because it's a very interesting bootcamp. The second one, last year we did the first. But then the project comes to an end, and then the project group will finalize, will write its report, and then what's next? So the question is to you, Angelo, what would you advise us? How to proceed from here? And we have built the Conservation Landowners Coalition, and we would love to keep that rolling. So just a word of advice from your side would be.
But what happens with a live project normally is that the live project begins when the project ends, especially in the field of nature conservation. With a preparatory project like this one, it's even more the case. I mean, you were setting the ground for a novel approach, and it takes time to create the conditions really to step it up. You remember that every time we met, I was insisting a lot that you implement as much as you can, because by doing that, you create the conditions for a certain level of continuity. In reality, maybe you have not done that much testing within the project, but you have collected information that show that things have been moving underground and quite substantially. Not everywhere across Europe, but still. So now I understand from my former colleagues that the next commission will be all about implementation. So the regulation time is sort of gone by, which is not bad. I mean, I think that it would be a revolution in itself because we always produce bills and then we never really spend time to see whether these laws are implemented and enforced. So if we dedicate 5 years to full implementation, why not? Especially if it's good implementation. Your task is to make sure that this happens in your own little constituency, so the private land conservation thing. You have until May. In May, your project closes. And when the project closes, usually the drama is that the entropy of the project also all of a sudden bloop, disappears. So my advice to you is that you sit down now and you think seriously about what you can still do with your time, your people and your money until May to secure the conditions after May to continue. Which means, where do I find the cash? And where do I find the partners? The partners, it's easy. You have them. That's the most complicated thing in any sort of a human adventure, especially in this area. Then the next, which is complicated but is not impossible, is where do I find the cash? You have heard already a number of different possibilities. You know of some yourself. My invitation to you is to really sit down and start thinking seriously about an implementation project or initiative for private land conservation for the next 5-6 years. And then we will meet in 5-6 years and you will not speak anymore about 6 countries which are front runners, but maybe 15. Or maybe we will even have a regulatory approach at EU level on that issue. I'm not convinced, but it could be the case. And then I will ask you if you give me the floor 1 last minute at the end of the thing, because I have a message for everyone.
Please keep it. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this advice. And I think in the next session after this panel, you will hear already a bit of outlooks for after the project. That's for later. I will do a last statement for you. So, do you think that's because I was thrilled by this panel and their wise words? Do you think that you received enough ammo for discussions during lunch and this afternoon? If you're pro, then I would like to see hands. Okay, that's quite good. Yeah? So it's more than 80%. So very good. So that's a big thank you to you, yeah? From the audience, for all your wise words and for coming us and telling your nice stories. Thank you. Yeah. Also, you want to have this last minute?
Just is more a political statement. Okay. Political in the social terms, if you want. We have political elections coming up for Europe. You remember, huh? So normally we don't think that this particular experience of let's say A-Life projects or something financed by Europe, if you want, for something good for Europe. Does this have any particular interest, or could this influence the way my friends, my relatives, my neighbors, they vote, or they would even go to vote in the next EP's elections? I think they could. So my invitation to you is to become little ambassadors for the next election, to bring, for once, Europe did not approach the problem by way of regulation. It's about voluntary schemes for private landowners that are still kept owners of their land and the destiny of their land, that engage in something good for everyone. So I think it's a quite nice message to show that Europe is not that bad as sometimes we are depicted, and maybe you could have a little influence on 2, 3, 4, 10, 100 people, which are all of them express one vote at least. So that's a vote advice. Thank you. Thank you.